going to talk a lot about ways in which digital technologies and current advances in web-based resources can be combined with what's now known about the science of learning to advance education. We're going to focus primarily not on K-12 education, which is what most people seem to think of reflexively when they think of the term education, but rather on higher education, which many have argued is not necessarily broken in this country. But even if it's not broken, it still has room for improvement. So we want to talk about that. So we have a very distinguished group of panelists here today, and I'd like to ask each of you please to introduce yourselves and just say a word or two about what your areas of specialty are and your background. And then we'll have a discussion with the panel for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'm very interested in opening it to the audience because we'd all like to know what you think and what you're interested in. Thank you. Why don't we just start and go this way.
Shai Reshef, University of the People, which is a non-profit, tuition-free, degree-granting online university dedicated to open the gates to higher education for everyone. I myself came from for-profit education. I started the first for-profit online university in Europe. I sold it, used the money to create a University of the People.
My name is Katie Salen. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit based here in New York called Institute of Play. My background is in game design, and we have been doing a range of work both with K-12 but also with higher education and looking at the ways in which game design principles can help transform the way that we think about teaching and learning.
Hey there, I'm Charles Best, founder of a nonprofit organization called DonorsChoose.org, which I started while teaching history at a public high school in the Bronx. You can think of our site as Kickstarter for public school teachers in low-income communities. Teachers create classroom project requests. Donors can choose the project they want to support and hear back from the classroom they chose to help.
I'm John Maida, the president of Brown School of Design. We've been around for 136 years, my institution. I didn't start it, by the way, but I was formerly from the Media Lab. I headed research there, and I've been learning how an offline campus functions in the intimate level, and how these two worlds don't really connect so easily, the cyber world and the offline world. So that's my interest.
My name is Daniel Leviton. I'm the Dean of Arts and Humanities at the Minerva Schools at KGI. And my background is in the field of neuroaesthetics. My training is in neuroscience, and I study how art, and in particular music, impacts the brain.
Thank you. So we heard comment about the interface between the digital world, the online world, and the offline world, which I assume is kind of bricks and mortar, more traditional education. One major bridge that's been developed recently for trying to add to what happens in bricks and mortar institutions by taking advantage of what can be done in the digital world are MOOCs. They've been hyped. They've been written about endlessly. There's been an enormous amount of discussion about what the virtues and possible drawbacks may be. And I thought it would be useful if we all could reflect on that for a moment or two and think about what might be the advantages, if any, and potential drawbacks of integrating MOOCs into the standard kinds of curricula, if they should be integrated. So any of you have any thoughts about this? John?
Yeah, just last night on Twitter, my friend who's a professor at INSEAD put on Twitter how he thinks that a lecture is basically an ad for knowledge. And that's the same with a MOOC. We want the lecture to give us more information, but it's just an ad. And I think that's quite reflective of a fact. He's a professor at INSEAD, I was professor at MIT. Lecture is very powerful, but it is the environment that creates something much different.
So let me ask a follow-up on that. If it's an ad, doesn't that usually serve to direct you where you can find the product? So
it gives you the navigation system to intellectually buy something. If you contrast that to my campus, which is all hands-on art making, you can really see the difference.
what's the difference?
The difference is that most of the knowledge learned by my students aren't in a lecture form. It's all in the practice form, in the making form, which is so hard to put online. So you see the difference.
Okay. Shai, do you have something?
Yeah, I think that the MOOCs are one of the greatest things that happened recently, because I don't see any better reason for the invention of the internet than spreading the knowledge everywhere. And that's what the MOOC does, or do, the many MOOCs that are there right now. And I think that it's a great phenomenon where the best universities and the best professors in the world come and say, here is our knowledge, here is our courses, go and use them. Saying that, it is the knowledge. It's not, I don't think that it's much beyond that, because the way it is being broadcast can hardly be more than just a general knowledge. If you look at the results of the MOOCs, 80% of their students have advanced degrees. I would bet that the rest 20% are students who currently study the same subject and say, oh, here's the best professor in the world teaching the same topic. I'll watch him the same time. But looking at this great population of qualified students who take the MOOC, only 7% of them complete the courses. And the reason for that is that it's extremely hard. You need self-motivation. You need to be there and study very hard in order to get it. So it's a great thing to have. It's a great general enrichment, but I don't see it as a way to reach grades, to reach credits, and definitely not to reach a degree. By the way, the MOOCs put 20, sometimes 100,000 students in one classroom. When we teach, we put them group of 20s, because we believe that you need this small group of students to study together in order for it to be effective, in order to help each other, study with each other, and really get the material. But we have a different offering. But I think, again, the MOOC is great. We need to go the next step with it.
Katie, did you have something?
Well, I'll just build on that. So I think that one of the challenges with the way that MOOCs have been run is that they're reproducing, in some sense, some of the I'm going to put a caveat around this, some of the worst teaching practices for most kids. So many kids, young people, whether they're in K-12 or at university level, don't learn well from a direct lecture. We actually know this from research. Mm-hmm. And what MOOCs have done, at least in these early stages, is just reproduce that kind of form of learning, which there isn't a lot of learning happening per the 7% statistic. So I think that there is tremendous possibility, but we have to really rethink the form of a MOOC and ask questions around what does it really look like to engage people in online learning. And sort of having them watch a video of a lecture is one component, but there is a whole other set of pedagogical concerns that we really have to look at. And the second thing is that there are an enormous number of people that are not prepared, again, to your point, to learn in that way. We did some work. We have a public school here in New York, and we did an experiment with some of our sixth graders around language learning, because we didn't have funding to hire a language teacher. So we thought, well, let's try to do some kind of online learning course. And the sixth graders had no ability, actually, to do self-paced learning on their own, because prior to that point, they'd never been supported in doing that in their prior schools. And the same thing with MOOCs. If we imagine that's a form, we have to kind of backwards design what are all the experiences that young people need to have before they're able to engage in that form in an effective way.
So you said two things that I heard that I thought particularly interesting. One was that there is something about the way MOOCs are currently being presented that's non-optimal. It takes advantage of techniques that have turned out not to be very useful, which I think is very well known. Mm-hmm. And the second is there's preparation that might be necessary to try to lead people to be able to take advantage of that. Could you say a word or two more about each of those points?
Well, so the first point is that direct lecture is a kind of 19th century model. And in all of the progressive education research over the past 50 years, we understand that that's actually not a great way for lots of people to learn. So it's interesting that we're reproducing that, which we tend to do with new technologies, right? We tend to reproduce our kind of old, comfortable form before we get to a point where we can rethink what it might look like. So I think the challenge is to say, well, what could a MOOC really look like, knowing that there is incredible reach, right? Incredible opportunity around community, right? Thousands of people together in a space wanting to learn together. What do you do with that, right? You don't just throw a video up for them, right? You begin to think about all of the ways that digital media, social media tools can really enable those folks to connect to each other.
So
right?
could you say, let me just push a
Yeah.
tiny bit on this. Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating line of thought. So what would you do?
Well, I don't have the answer, but one of the things that we do know is that digital media, and in particular the kind of technology platforms that are now available, really support community. And we know that community really supports peer-to-peer learning. So I would begin to look at what are kinds of design structures that you can put in place that really support people. It could be small groups. It could be different kinds of expertise and reputation that people are able to build as mentors within these spaces. But how do you begin to turn the learning onto the participants rather than holding it sort of in the hand of the expert? So I think, and there's lots of experiments being done around that. So I think that there's lots of hope for what's possible. But we do need to move beyond that kind of vision of what a MOOC is.
Okay, let's return to the preparation piece in a bit. I think Dan had something he wanted to say.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on the points made by Katie and John. I have three things to say about MOOCs. The first is that we want to be careful not to lump them all together because there are good ones and bad ones. They're not all the same in terms of quality. The second point is that I think that MOOCs are perpetuating a bad model that we see in the classroom and we have seen for decades, if not centuries, before MOOCs, which is the lecture is not an efficient way to transmit information. And it's not intended in the university for that to be the primary way that the students learn. Really, the learning happens in the textbook or the readings that they're given. And the reason for that is that the lecturer can't speak as fast as the student can read, right? So all you can hope to get out of the very best lecture is to motivate the students to go to the reading. It's an ad, it intrigues them, it sparks their curiosity. And of course, in every university, there are students who only go to the lecture and they don't do the reading, and they don't tend to learn the material or do well on exams, even though they're admonished that the lecture is just skimming the surface. And I think an important distinction is that high school education in most US public high schools, the secondary school teacher who's giving a lecture really does cover all the material. In the university, that's not the model. The university lecturer is covering a little bit, the interesting things to motivate you. So the downside of MOOCs is that they're perpetuating this idea that you can learn everything that you need to know from a lecture. The third thing that's interesting about it, though, is that I think they're fulfilling a role similar to that as the libraries did when Benjamin Franklin introduced the public library. They're making information and knowledge available to all, basically for free. And I think that's, I think it's not just an important, but an essential property of a free society, is that, and a democratic society, that information should be available to all, not only to those who can afford it. And although we're not providing all the information we want in these massive online courses, we're providing enough to get people started. And so that's a positive.
So an interesting thing, this idea that MOOCs can be viewed as almost ads. So if we viewed them that way, if we thought of MOOCs as really trying to motivate students to be interested in something that they then pursue on their own, how would they be different? If we tried to optimize for that, so Dan, you said that some MOOCs are better than others. Well, better can be interpreted in lots of different ways. Let's do it this way. Let's say that we want to think about a good MOOC as one that motivates you to go learn more. If that's how we look at it, what would be different about the way MOOCs should be prepared and delivered than the way they are now?
I'll give an example of a MOOC that I want to personally take that I heard a rumor of. I'm not fractionally as knowledgeable as my peers here when it comes to MOOCs and what makes a good one, but there's this one I want to take. And it's what I heard Bob Carey, formerly of the New School, wants to teach. And that is a MOOC on how to write legislation. And he says from his experience when he was a senator, when sort of common interest, social good activists would come into his office, they would sit down and they would try and persuade him of the goodness of their cause. And senators in that position will often kind of nod their heads and say, yeah, you know, I'm with you on that. And the social good activist would leave the office thinking, all right, I got that senator on my side. They empathized with me. They said they agreed. I made them feel the fire. That was a success. And then the special interest person would come into the senator's office an hour later and would say, here's this one paragraph that we want inserted into this specific bill. yes or no, will you insert that paragraph in there? If not, expect no more campaign contributions. If yes, expect us to support you. And the art of it was actually in the writing of that paragraph. And hearing Bob Carey describe this made me think of having read the Power Broker and how Robert Moses' sort of special sauce was his ability to write legislation and make one term on page 1 that seems innocuous refer to a different definition than you might think on page 20, and before you knew it, you had given up control of the parks or the bridges without anybody actually knowing it, because there was this art to writing legislation. And Bob Carey said that this is the art of writing legislation can actually be taught in 3 months. There's a vocabulary, there's a domain expertise that doesn't take too long to convey, and it would mean so much if the social good activists knew how to come in, sit opposite a senator, and simply say, yes or no, will you insert this paragraph into this specific bill, and then we will know if you really do stand with us. So in any case, I feel like that's an example of it's a MOOC I want to take.
So you're already motivated.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic, and I think there should be more MOOCs, like more books and other forms of information that people want to read or acquire. But what I'm interested in is if we think of MOOCs as having a different role, where they're kind of advertisements, where they give you the tip of the iceberg but motivate you to want to go under the surface and get more depth. If we think of them that way, how should they be structured? What would be different from the way they are now?
Well, as the beginner of the terrible ad metaphor, I want to add another metaphor, which came from Stephen Tepper from Vanderbilt. Talks about how when you think about students in the world they will move in today, it's like we're moving. He says we're moving we're in an economy that's moving from an economy of elves, Santa's elves in the factory, to fairies, like a tooth fairy, that wander and have to find their own path. That very set type of job no longer exists. This kind of nomadic job is the new norm. And when you think of that market we're designing for, that future we're designing for, I think of Katie's work and the work that she leads as really fitting what is happening to where they will become. So I would say Katie has part of the answer in a big way.
Let's loop back to Katie for that seems to have dropped this year. Let's loop back to Katie for a minute here, who talked about how preparation is critical if people can be able to take advantage of MOOCs. If we think of MOOCs as kind of the tip of an iceberg that are designed to help you, to lead you in and encourage you to get more depth, how should we prepare people at a young age so they can take advantage of resources like that?
Well, I can talk to that a little bit, and I'll maybe finish up on the end of the last question. So one thing to think about is that the ad or the MOOC is the motivator. Another is that there are other sites around young people's interests that then direct you to a MOOC. So we often talk about in our work with teachers creating what we call a need to know in kids. So we actually know we really learn best when we have a context for that learning. So sometimes just the fact that I need to take a computer science course isn't enough of a motivating factor for me. But if I'm trying to build a piece of software because I'm trying to get it in the App Store, I'm probably going to be motivated in a really different way to seek out a MOOC, right? And I'm only going to be listening for the things that are making sense in the context of this project, this thing, this goal that I have that I'm trying to work for. So one of the things that we've been doing a lot of thinking about, if you think about higher education, you have to, again, backwards design to understand, well, what are the types of experiences primary school kids are having, middle school kids, high school kids. And right now, the kinds of experiences they're having, as I said, don't prepare them at all for an ability to enter into a MOOC in any kind of productive way. So one of the types of experiences that young people need to have is an ability to grapple with a complex problem where all of the information isn't given to you, that you have to actually seek it out, and that you have some ability to choose the problem that you're working on. And that there are, in some sense, real stakes for what happens. There's a kind of a specific goal, and you as a community are working towards trying to solve a problem, come up with a solution, build a product. And then in those kinds of contexts, they're incredibly ambiguous, right? So it moves away from the standardized test culture where there's often a very clear sense of, yes, what's right and what's wrong in an answer, into this, it's really a space of design, of ambiguity around what a possible solution might be. And so one thing is you have to provide students with more opportunities to do that kind of grappling with hard problems. And also, just as John said, this sort of learning by doing, so that you are actively trying to seek out information rather than passively being a kind of receptor of it. And right now, a lot of high school education is not serving young people in that way.
Other thoughts on this? All right, why don't we segue slightly. The web is more than about MOOCs. You can do a lot of interactive kinds of things with the web. How should we be taking advantage of that for teaching? Is it just going to be adaptive learning systems where you're learning a language and you make a mistake, it gives you feedback? Or is there something more powerful, broader, that can both motivate and teach using what the technology, Web 2.0 or 2.5, wherever we are now, what the web technology can do? Yes.
Just coming to this panel, I kept wondering about things and about the best teachers and the best lectures, and I think, man, I didn't have the best. I had maybe one really good one that helped me along the way, but this notion that I can have the best of everything, will it make me better, is a question I often ask, because I think teachers don't just serve the role of they're the best in the world at something. They play an important role in just being that person that was there and present so your life changed. Like I had a teacher, chemistry teacher in 11th grade that saw me. My parents said I should go to MIT. My parents had a tofu factory. I had no idea where MIT was. I went to school. My teacher said, oh, you can go to MIT. And then he came to my parents' store in Chinatown and said to my parents, your son should go to college this summer and take a few organic chemistry classes, and I'll show you how to do it. My parents said, no, he has to work this summer. And no, you have to say, this will help him get to whatever. And so that, a computer coming in to do that is hard to imagine. Secondly, Sugata Mitra's work. No. He's the person who put a computer in the slums. And, and I love his granny cloud concept in the granny cloud. It's British grandmothers communicating over Skype in a slum in India where they're all saying oh, I need help. And good job, good job. Just giving the recognition that the kids need to kind of keep moving forward. I'm a big believer in that paradigm. I guess I'm old-fashioned too, maybe.
I'm not sure. Well, we're using technology in order. We are online university, so technology is our mean to spread the knowledge and to teach. We have students from 137 countries who use computer to study. However, we are great believers in the simplicity of technology. One of the, I believe, big mistakes that a lot of us are trying to do, and it's especially true in education, let's use the most sophisticated technology to teach. And yeah, it is true that the technology today are very sophisticated and you can really enrich people with it. The price with it is that when you look at the world, most of the people do not have the most sophisticated technology. So in our case, we don't use broadband, no video, no audio. Everything is text-based. Because 20% of our students use dial-up in order to study. Many of them use internet cafe in order to study, but they can still study. So if you want to study, the technology is there for you to study. Now, the question is, what do you do out of it? I think that the video and audio and the MOOCs are great things to enrich. They are not necessarily essential in order to get good education. The way we teach is peer-to-peer learning. They study from each other, under supervision of instructor. But they study, it's a peer-to-peer learning, study with each other, from each other, very engaging, very satisfactory. So what I'm saying is the technology is great, but I'm not sure that we should chase the best technology. The technology is already there to teach the entire world, and that's what we should do.
Yeah.
The thing that worries me about that is you potentially end up with a lot of students who become autodidacts, who engage with the text in their own mind and never have an opportunity to test out how well they've learned it or how they've understood it against other real people. And with technology changing as fast as it does, I imagine that it won't be long before that 20% who are on dial-up will have full bandwidth. And the model that I'm committed to these days is the model of real interaction. in small numbers, one-to-one interaction between professors and students in classes that have no more than 20 students, because I think that's where the real learning happens. And when you look at those of us who teach in universities for a living, the lectures are sort of a necessary evil in the way that the universities have been organized, but the real learning happens in the small seminars. And the technology, video conferencing technology in all its forms, allows for two things that you otherwise don't get. It allows for the student in an intimate setting, 19 other students and a professor, to explore the applications of those ideas that they've learned from the book, to test them out on other students. And it allows the professor to give them immediate feedback about whether they've understood it or not. And this is an ongoing, continuous process. The idea is you're not getting assessed once at the end of the semester. You're getting assessed every time you interact with the other students and with the professor. And we know from the science of learning that's how real learning happens. Look at Mozart as an example. He had the very best music teacher in the world at the time, his father, Leopold, who was giving him lessons every day with immediate feedback and a few hits of the stick probably. Mm-hmm. But the point is that when you look at the biographies of the great geniuses throughout history, most of them were not autodidacts. They were people who had a very concerned teacher intimately involved with them at a formative point.
Just a comment. I totally agree with you. I just don't think that you need video for that. Other than that, I agree with you totally, but okay.
So one of the things that Dan just said that I find really interesting reflects on the science of learning. So we know that people learn best when they engage in something called deliberate practice. So deliberate practice occurs when you sometimes make a mistake and you get feedback immediately, not only that you've made the mistake, but also what you should have done, what the correct move would have been. Very quick feedback with constructive information that you can then follow up on. So if you're doing asynchronous learning, there's a real problem with the feedback piece. And there's also a problem with tuning the constructive part so it's yoked to what they actually did wrong. So I'm wondering if more generally, if we could segue for a moment to the science of learning, we can take advantage of what's been discovered in cognitive science and in neuroscience about how the mind and brain works, and instead of just believing that certain practices are the best way to do it, actually ground them in empirical facts. Do you have any thoughts about that approach, any of you? Yeah, Dave.
This isn't necessarily science, but it's what I've observed. Being in an art school, you see the first year students who used to draw maybe like an hour a week or something, or 2 hours a week, they're drawing like 40, 80 hours a week that first year. And because drawing in that context isn't drawing to draw something, it's drawing to think at the same time, to fail in a very tight closed loop thing. And I didn't quite understand until I brought some executives from Samsung. The highest level executives came to campus and we showed them around. And then we took them to our nature lab. In nature lab, we have all these microscopes, the old samples of animals, et cetera, and plants and minerals. And we got them around microscopes with sketchbooks. And they all kind of thing, my friend from Samsung said, these guys never leave headquarters. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't take them away from the microscopes because they were engaged in such a closed loop deliberative act that they weren't used to in their daily lives as executives. That struck me as that kind of thing that happens when you are doing in that space.
So this is something you observed that turns out to be really useful. Could you take advantage of it to begin with? That is, actually design the activity with the knowledge in hand that close feedback loops are important, having constructive feedback is important, getting people involved in what's called depth of processing. So it turns out the more you think something through, the more likely you are to remember it, whether you want to or not, by the way.
Yeah.
It's a well-known fact in the science of learning. There's a lot of these kinds of things. Can you design the activities with those kinds of things in mind?
Well, that's what happens in the studio-style learning. That closed loop, that peer-to-peer system is occurring. It's rich in feedback, and rich in feedback from here and also here.
Right, so just to build on that, one of the themes that is coming up is the peer-to-peer learning, and also this notion that there is a need for a kind of expert to be in the room to really help support. So one thing that the web does enable is that it provides an opportunity actually for multiple people to be experts. So if you look at any interest-driven community, and we can just pick fan fiction, as a really simple example. So Harry Potter, right? Millions of people around the world in love with Harry Potter, writing stories into the world of Harry Potter. And they're doing this outside of the context of school. They're in intergenerational communities, so there are grandmothers with 8-year-olds. And there are thousands of people available to give feedback to you on your story. And while there is definitely levels of expertise within that community, and people have reputation around the kind of feed that they might be able to give you, it's always available, that kind of feedback. You don't have to wait for a certain time of day to interact with your professor or to go to this kind of expert. And that, I think, is actually the real power of technology. It's not about the technology, but what it enables for people. And in this case, it's really a very different kind of role, that anyone at some point can be both a learner and an expert, and that you're constantly flipping back and forth between those two roles. And I think there's genuine learning that happens when that goes on.
Okay, I would like to open this up to the audience now, because I think it's really important that you all have a chance to ask questions of these distinguished scholars and practitioners and get a chance to learn what you're interested in learning. So why don't we do that, then we'll close at the very end with the last bit. So the lights are very glary here, so if you raise your hand up high. Pardon me?
I'm here. So I just wanted to ask, one of the questions about MOOCs that hasn't come up is that they're less about learning but about credentials, and what credentials are useful and the cost of getting credentials. So that I actually teach an anti-MOOC right now at NYU that is an internationally distributed set of people who have come to me to say, we need a credential in improving our environmental health, our local environmental health. They have asked me for this credential. I'll gladly give it to them because I'm going to learn from them as one of the many experts, and the capacity that we have for project-driven, contextualized, in situ material and local experimentation, and then having the international comparison is very powerful for these people locally to have the stuff that they might be doing anyway amplified, credentialed, and now the city in Mauritius and Manchester and Melbourne and all these places are listening to these people because they have some credential that actually, it's not, it's not accredited by the middle states, it's not accredited, it's just something they wanted and needed. And it's that kind of self-creation that I think is a powerful, two things. The power, the cost of doing credentials, the cost of innovating credentials, the time it takes to innovate credentials so that they're appropriate for what people need and want to do, and the material context in addition to the peer and project-driven, the kind of the feedback that you get from actual material context, material experimentation that you can't generalize in the traditional MOOC model.
So do you have a question for our group here?
Yeah, so what is it that the credential pressure does to changing how we teach, right? The shifting need for credentials that are, not predicted by the accreditation boards. And what is it that the way that we can exploit both the peer-driven and material learning of experimentation, what John Dewey called, that experiments are not the domain of professional scientists, but what we all need to do. So both material and credential reinforcement. Okay,
so what do you think about the pressure to get credentialed and how that's shaping what we teach and why we teach it? Dan?
I just have one thought about this, which is that in the last 10 years, information has become free. And this is a dramatic revolution, and we're now seeing students who have been on the internet since they were 4 or 5 years old. We're seeing them come into universities. It used to be that a lot of what we did in the university was teach students how to find information. And that was a laborious process. You'd go to the library, you'd look up a book in the card catalog, you'd walk to the shelf, you'd pull the book down, oops, wrong book. You go back to the card catalog. It could take hours to find what it is you needed to know about photosynthesis or the Krebs cycle, if you couldn't remember it. Now, you have it on your phone instantly. So the credential that we need to give, I think, shouldn't certify people for the knowledge they've acquired, but for the ability to apply that knowledge and to think critically. And I think that's a fundamental shift in our responsibility as educators. We're no longer training people to acquire massive amounts of information, although they need some. What we're really training them to do is to think critically. And thinking critically isn't one thing. It's probably 2 or 3 dozen different things that can be broken down.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
I think as someone who runs a college, people pay for our credential to get a degree from Round School of Design. Every month I'm signing new diplomas. It's like signing money, basically. Like this signature will make the credential happen. I always find it kind of awkward and interesting because that credential will last. It has a value. That said, though, there is a world where those people who cannot afford the credential want some kind of credential. And I think that world is emerging because of people like Natalie and other faculty who, in every university, who are engaged in this MOOC world or whatever you call it. I mean, there's so many flavors of this. And the faculty that do that as side projects. They do it for humanity. And what hasn't happened yet in universities as a whole is a tenure system itself doesn't acknowledge that kind of service work. If that system begins to open up, we'll see a massive boom in brands of one faculty will be able to amalgamize into a credential. That hasn't happened yet, but it will happen.
Interesting.
I'll just add a little bit. So one shift that's happening, again, when you begin to look at interest-driven spaces around how to think about credentialing is this question of kind of badging or incentives, things that you might earn by performing in a particular way within some kind of environment. So there's a company called Top Coder, which some of you may know, which is a competition-based product development space. So it's a community of people who know how to program computers. Any company can pitch a project to be produced by the community of coders. So the coders can work on it, they come up with a solution, so on. But what's interesting is that every programmer has a profile within the Top Coder community. And it doesn't stop with a credential that says, I know how to program, but it shows their ongoing practice over time, number of competitions that they've entered, how many competitions they've been successful at, how many they've stopped, how many they quit. And so that notion of a kind of dynamic dossier, which connects to the notion of applied practice, moves beyond the notion that I take a test and get a credential, which means at one point in time I knew something, to a more dynamic practice-based credential, which says I know something and I continue to apply what I know over time. And at any moment you can register how good I am at that particular thing, not just on my own, but relative to other folks in a community that share expertise that I have. And that, I think, is a very powerful model.
Well, this is something that LinkedIn has started to do, right? You can certify the people in your network for being experts in certain skills.
Yeah. So that takes advantage of technology. And it also moves us away from this sort of standardized test thing where you kind of get a stamp which says at some moment in time I knew how to do this one thing.
So it sort of blends reputation with certification.
Absolutely.
Which may be a new trend that we're going to see a lot more.
And it shows that you have to demonstrate it. You have to continue a demonstration of that knowledge and expertise.
So like chess masters, I guess, have a performance-based rating scheme that's dynamically allocated.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. I think somebody else. Yes.
Yeah,
Sorry?
I have the microphone, thank you.
Oh, I can't.
He has the power, I have the mic.
Okay.
So actually, everything everybody said I thought was very helpful and is moving in the right direction, although obviously there'll be sort of acute disagreements on the smaller metrics. But it seemed to me what Katie said about the need to know is really essential, that we now know that education is entirely desire-based. You don't get an education unless you have a desire to have one, whether it's in a given subject, whatever it might be. The desire is, forefronts the actual education. I just had the experience of watching students in Egypt demand to have courses in histories of revolutions so that they would know what the indices of success of revolutions are. And that need to know curriculum was then a kind of response to the students' needs. The second thing is peer teaching, which you mentioned. I think we underestimate the enormous value of the ways in which students teach other students, whether it's in the classroom, in the dormitory, in labs, wherever it is. They share values, they share cultural indices that are the same, they teach each other. We tend to ignore that. And we know from Rancière, for instance, that illiterate people can teach literacy, for instance. There is a kind of way in which teaching in the pedagogical formats that we have used in the past are not that effective. Thirdly, I think we should give up the idea of disciplines. Disciplines, like the traditional forms of pedagogy, tend to produce ignorance rather than knowledge. And one can think about the way in which medicine doesn't teach health, for instance. One can think about the way architecture doesn't teach acoustics. I mean, there's hundreds of examples of the way in which disciplines...
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we don't have much time left, and I'm wondering if you have a question in there for the group?
Well, I guess my question is, nobody discussed disciplines as a form of teaching, which is not... I don't think it matters which technology it is, but I would ask the panel to address the issue of disciplines.
So what are your views about the utility or lack of utility of having disciplines, or the disciplines that we currently have, which are largely historically determined, necessarily the best ones? Views?
I'm a big believer in disciplines, because by having disciplines, you enable the ability to go across them. I think that if they're completely sort of non-porous, it doesn't work, but then when you have disciplines with porousness, it works great.
Anybody have a counter view? Charles, you're looking thoughtful.
Nothing to add.
Okay, well, we move to the next question. Why don't we go to this side of the room, if we can?
Well, I'm sorry, I have the microphone.
I'm
I'm sorry, you just put it in my hand, me.
Oh.
But it's a very quick question, I promise.
Okay.
No state. And it's based on something that Dan said earlier, which is that what we used to do in the way of teaching, or what a standard teaching protocol is information. We impart information, or at least how to find it. And the other important thing is critical thinking. It seems to me we've always done those two things together. Now the question is, they seem to be being separated, because we think information and how to get it can be taken care of by the internet, but critical thinking now stands alone. My question is, can you really pull those two things apart, or do they honestly to go together in the best pedagogy?
Okay, critical thinking, does it need to be bundled with information dissemination, or is there still a role for just having information dissemination, not in the context of critical thinking?
I think part of critical thinking is examining the source of information. So not just taking what you get as the first answer on your cell phone or your iPad, but asking yourself, is this an authoritative source? Is it reasonable? Can I do a back-of-the-napkin calculation to figure out whether it's within an order of magnitude of what the answer should be if it's quantitative? What biases might have entered into this report on the part of the people who are hosting the website, or the part of the people who are trying to disseminate the information? There's dozens of these kinds of things, and so I think you're right. In that sense, we're not separating the acquisition of information from the critical thinking. But I take as a given that the information itself is free and easy to get, but it's not necessarily easy to tell the wheat from the chaff, and that's what we have to teach. I had a freshman class at McGill, and these are top students. They didn't even know about Google Scholar. They knew about Google, but they didn't know that in the hierarchy of web search engines, Google Scholar is going to tend to give them better hits for scientific questions. So it's that kind of thing, I think.
So
what are your thoughts?
That's not fair.
Hold on, let's ask the other panelists. Do you all think you can teach critical thinking via the web?
Well, I don't know that, yeah, so I think it's absolutely critical. And we know in all of the discussions around students graduating from high school, there's a kind of competency called digital citizenship. And one big piece of that is how to help students make sense of information. So one of the big challenges is there's just so much information. And also students tend to filter it through very particular kinds of filters. So we've done some work with kids in Oakland who they've never searched through Google. They only search on Facebook. So their sense of what information matters is just that information within their network. It would never have occurred to them actually to go to Google in a wider source. They search just on their phones within Facebook. So this orientation towards understanding what are even our own filters around the type of information that's coming in, how do we make sense of that? And also the information that's easiest to get is not always the best information. So there is a kind of culture of just getting it because it's easy to get rather than thinking really reflectively about it. So I think it's absolutely critical that those two things are coupled together. And it's not easy to do. It's not in a curriculum. It's not something that's easy to measure. So it's very difficult, and again, I'm talking mostly here within the high school context, within the standardized test regime, for teachers to focus on that piece because it's actually not valued in some sense. Because it's hard to measure. Yeah.
John, one last
Yeah,
comment on that?
in the same way that you're saying where we acquire information and we have critical thinking to process it, we also have the making part. So in a school like ours, we call it critical making. So critical thinking, inspiring the making that happens.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, if the microphone could migrate to this half of the room and give them a chance.
Hello, my name's Amy Davis. I'm a director at Chapek Research and a grad student at Harvard. From the perspective of someone who's come from being a non-traditional learner to then going into a traditional system, I wonder how with the internet we will deal with like canon of knowledge issues, in the sense that a lot of people who learn on their own or learn outside of a conventional community have like huge gaping holes in their knowledge, even though they know lots of other really cool things. So how do you think we might address that issue so that when people collaborate research-wise or otherwise with each other, those issues get filled and we don't have massive misunderstanding? Okay.
Okay, so how do we systematize knowledge in a way that allows people to become more than well-rounded, have a sense of what they don't know and what they need to know in a given context? How do we deal with the fact that if you're self-guided, you're liable to have big gaps?
I feel like I'm talking too much, but I can talk a little bit about this piece. So one thing is there's been a shift in how we think about the notion of collaboration. So often collaboration in schools, even at the university level, was that you just got people together on a team and then you were going to work on a problem together. And what has started to shift in that is you start to think about what are the specializations, and I think is to your point around how do you make this happen, that you put a team together where the people they have some overlap in knowledge, but actually I have a certain kind of expertise and my expertise is required to solve the problem. So it's in gaming, it's called how to solve the free rider problem. So in a collaboration, there's often people that don't pull their weight. Well, if you have a team of specialists where each person is contributing something quite special, you can't free ride because it's very clear when you're not contributing and not solving the problem. So part of the answer might be what are the mechanics that we might need to have in place to allow that kind of team forming to happen? Which often in classrooms isn't sort of well thought through. It's just you put a group of kids together rather than really thinking about, well, what is someone's particular expertise? So that's a tiny piece of it we might think about.
Yeah.
I like group projects, and what I do when I assign students to groups is there'll typically be 4 or 5 students in a group. If there's more than that, it becomes unwieldy. Half their grade comes from my assessment of their project. The other half their grade comes from an assessment of their peers on a scale of 1 to 10 about how well they contributed to the group. So it solves the free rider problem or the grandstanding problem. And I think the other aspect that group projects can address in terms of a canon of knowledge, if you're teaching a music class, for example, or a literature class, I mean, it's clearest to me how this works in the arts. Maybe the goal of the course is to teach 300 years of music. You give each person on the team a different composer to look into, and then as a team they have to come together and find commonalities. Same thing works for art. If somebody's doing Rubens and someone else is doing Picasso and someone else is doing Diebenkorn, they have to talk about points of commonality. So as you say, they're experts in that domain for the week that they're on the group project.
Yeah.
So John earlier said that one thing MOOCs can be thought of as doing reasonably well, or having the capability of doing reasonably well, is serving as advertisements. And I'm wondering if there might be a role for MOOCs to serve as maps, where they can orient you to big swaths of intellectual territory, so you have some sense of where the gaps are. Is there a way that MOOCs could be set up in a way that people would find appealing to get a sense of being oriented across a field?
That's a great idea. Company.
Okay, well, let's see, other questions?
Hello, I'm Vaughn Rogers. I'm from the Seton Hall University Diplomacy School. And I just have a question about the value of a college degree, actually. It used to be that you had to have a bachelor's, really, that was kind of the gateway, and now it more and more is becoming master's degrees. And eventually, I see it going to PhDs, and I feel like the U.S. is really starting to be like South Korea, in that there's so many people who are educated with so many high degrees, and yet there are no jobs for these people. So how do you think we can revive the value of these higher education degrees?
Yeah, Shai.
I think that college degree is the minimum that everyone should get worldwide. And it's not trivial. Now, it is true that worldwide, there is a great correlation between the level of your achievement, meaning if you have high school, bachelor, master, or PhD, there is a great correlation between how much money you are going to earn than to your degree. But college degree is the minimum. Years ago, high school diploma was the minimum, but it's not anymore. But saying that, when you look around the world, most of the people in the world have problem reaching toward a degree. UNESCO stated that in 2025, assuming that the growth of the world population will continue as it is right now, and the opening of new universities will continue as they are right now, in 2025, 100 million students, again, 100 million students would be deprived from higher education for the pure reason of lacking enough seats to put them in. Now, I believe that if we want the world to be more advanced, if we want the entire world to be more advanced, if we want people to strive for their future rather than to fight with each other, we need better education, and we need to make sure that the entire world, first of all, start with elementary school, and this one is, I guess many of you know, the new initiative of the Secretary General, but eventually that everyone will have the opportunity for higher education and to get a bachelor degree. The world will be a much better place for them, for their families, and for the place that we live in.
How does this intersect with our earlier discussion about credentialing? So are we more concerned about competences or about degrees?
I believe that you can't separate the two.
You can't separate them.
You cannot, because in a clean world, you know what you know, and it's good enough. Why should you have the degree? But one of the main reasons for having a degree is finding a job. And when you go to a job interview, they want to know whom you are. And the only way for them to know whom you are worldwide is if you have a degree. If you don't have a degree, some can evaluate your knowledge, some cannot. But even evaluate your knowledge, they don't know if you are a well-rounded student. So if you were in a good university and you get a good degree, that's the way to judge you. And I don't believe, and there are a lot of discussion in the value of accreditation and all the accreditation agencies, especially in the US, and it's a big debate. We are obviously part of it. But leave aside the debate, there is no better system in the world than degrees and accredited degrees. So,
okay, on that happy note of no better system, I want to ask one quick question for each of the panelists, then I'm afraid we're going to have to stop. If you could change one thing for the better in higher education today, what would that be? So Shai, why don't we start with you? Quick answers, please. We have to wrap this up. What would it be? Just move down the row.
I would work very hard to give access to everyone to higher education through technology, because I believe that technology can bridge the gap, and we should do it as soon as fast as we can.
Yeah, so I would also agree access, and part of that for me would be exploding the idea that formal institutions are the only place where learning counts. So beginning to look at ways of accrediting learning that's happening in spaces outside of a university setting.
A test that's worth teaching to. I feel like people presume that a standardized test by definition has to be rote and sort of soul crushing. But there's a American history book, textbook, by this woman, Joy Hakem, called A History of Us. And it's for younger kids, but it proves that there's such a thing as a textbook that's absolutely fascinating and that you'd consume as a pleasure read. And if there's such a thing as a fascinating pleasure read of a history textbook, there should be such a thing as a test that's worth teaching to.
I'm specifically interested in breaking down the barriers after college in terms of how people perceive different types of categories. You know, I graduate artists and designers. This person here, Babetolina, was instrumental in enabling our state, Rhode Island, for artists to get science funding because you had to have a PhD to get science funding. But now in Rhode Island, if you have an MFA or BFA, you can get it. So breaking down those barriers, I think, is very important.
I'd like to see more individualized instruction, harnessing the technology to create an environment where we use evidence-based instruction, personalized individual students.
Thank you all. I'd like to thank the Blouin Foundation for hosting this, all of you for attending, and of course, the panelists for contributing. Thanks.